Chapter 11, in which a noted historian confronts the ghost of his own work. Crispin stood frozen in the library alcove, the first edition of Pride and Prejudice heavy in his hands. Carrie's footsteps had faded, but the imprint of her fingers against his remained, an uncatalogued sensation that defied his usual taxonomies of experience. He traced the leather binding with his thumb. The power outage had exposed something in him, a structural flaw in the very foundation of his thinking that he couldn't unsee. The hushed sanctity of the library gradually returned, the soft rustle of turning pages, the distant murmur of a couple discussing a novel, the librarian's movements as she filed returned books, normal sounds, ordinary life continuing while his mind kept replaying that moment, that question, the warmth of her hand over his. Do you ever feel that the ghosts of the people you write about are disappointed in you? The question had inserted itself like an erroneous citation in his mental bibliography, impossible to dismiss, impossible to reconcile with his existing intellectual framework. He'd all but admitted to cowardice in front of an entire room. Admitted it again, here, to her alone. The words still felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd studied but never properly spoken. The librarian's watchful gaze found him, and he startled like a student caught plagiarizing. It was time to return the book. With careful steps that echoed unnaturally in the hushed space, he approached her desk. I believe that is to say, I've finished with this particular volume, he managed, the words tangling in his mouth. Thank you for the privilege of, well, it was quite remarkable the binding is exquisite, really, and one feels a certain, that is to say, when one handles such a... She regarded him with the practiced patience of someone who regularly dealt with the overwrought emotions of bibliophiles.
The first editions do tend to have that effect,
she said, taking the book with gloved hands.
Especially on those who truly appreciate them.
Yes, well, his face burned. I nearly dropped it when the lights... I can't tell you how mortified I would have been if any harm had come to it under my care. The librarian's severe expression softened almost imperceptibly.
But no harm did come to it, Dr. Shrike. And now it's safely back where it belongs.
She secured the book in its protective case with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed. Crispin watched, feeling a definitive click inside himself as the case was locked, as if a door to a cherished part of himself had just been shut for good. He should leave now, return to his cabin, prepare for tonight's debate with Maeve Penhaligon. There were notes to review, arguments to marshal, a position to defend, yet his feet refused to carry him toward the exit. Instead, he found himself drifting deeper into the library's embrace, past maritime histories and biographies, drawn by some unacknowledged impulse toward a particular shelf. Do you ever feel that the ghosts of the people you write about are disappointed in you? He paused at the fiction section, his eyes scanning the alphabetized spines until he found what he was looking for. There, filed properly under S, stood his own works. Not many, he was hardly prolific, but enough to occupy a modest space between Shelley and Silver. He reached for Trafalgar Tide, his most recent, his most successful. The cover showed a dramatic seascape, ships locked in battle amid smoke and cannon fire. His name stood out in embossed letters beneath the title Crispin Shrike. He pulled it from the shelf, the familiar weight settling into his palms. How long since he'd actually read it? Not since the final proofs, certainly. He'd been too busy moving on to the next project, the next batch of primary sources, the next set of facts to arrange in neat, defensible order. Crispin sank into a nearby armchair, angling the book to catch the light from a brass reading lamp. He flipped through until he found the passage about the young sailor's letter home. Private correspondence from the period indicates widespread apprehension among the lower ranks. Ordinary Seaman James Kilpatrick wrote to his mother on the 17th of September 1805.
I confess to you, mother, that I am afraid, not of fighting, though that terrifies me too, but that I shall die without ever seeing your face again. I dream of our cottage and wake to darkness and the creaking of this great wooden prison.
A wave of intellectual vertigo washed over him. He'd used the quote merely to support his assertion about widespread apprehension, reducing this young man's terror and homesickness to a footnote on morale. The letter had been longer, much longer. It had spoken of a sweetheart in Portsmouth, of a dog the sailor had raised from a puppy, of how the stars at sea made him feel both insignificant and somehow closer to God.
I find myself inventing stories about you, mother.
The letter had continued.
That you have a new shawl for church, that the apple tree has finally fruited, that you still set my place at table, though you know I cannot come.
He'd left all that out. Too personal, too speculative, not historically significant. A hot wave of shame crept up his neck, burning its way to his hairline. He hadn't told Kilpatrick's story. He'd used him as evidence. He'd rendered a living, breathing boy into a data point. A boy who, facing almost certain death, had summoned the courage to write of his fears and dreams with a vulnerability Crispin had never permitted himself in his entire career. Good God, he thought, his insides twisting. Kilpatrick was braver at 19, facing cannon fire than I have ever been in my entire life. A memory surfaced. His doctoral supervisor at Oxford, a formidable medieval historian with wild white hair and even wilder eyebrows, berating a student who'd ventured an imaginative interpretation of a monk's marginalia.
We are not in the business of fiction, Mr. Harper. We deal in what can be proven, not what might be guessed.
Crispin had taken that admonition to heart, carried it with him from the seminar room to his study, from academic papers to his historical books. He'd built his career on it, his reputation. But his mind drifted now to another Oxford figure, J.R.R. Tolkien, a philologist of immense scholarly rigour, who had nevertheless created a Middle-earth, a world born not of archives, but of myth, language, and profound imagination. The very same intellectual tradition that he had used to justify his rigid approach to history had also produced its complete opposite. He felt a sudden constriction in his chest, as if the very air were being pressed out of the room. The walls he'd built around his work weren't the necessary constraints of scholarship. They were the bars of a prison he'd constructed himself, brick by brick, footnote by footnote, year after year. His throat constricted, the library's calm order, once so soothing, now pressed in around him like the walls of a mausoleum. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of tombs, of things preserved but no longer living. The neat rows of books, the controlled atmosphere, the hushed voices, all of it suddenly felt like a part of the prison he'd built for himself. He needed to get out, away from these books, away from his own words staring back at him. Crispin closed Trafalgar Tide with a snap that earned him a sharp look from a nearby reader. He returned the book to its place on the shelf, the gesture feeling like the closing of a coffin lid. The air in the library had become stifling, close heavy with the spirits of all the stories confined to their pages, all the voices silenced by his own scholarly fastidiousness. Time to leave. He moved quickly out of the library and through the ship's spaces. Here was a door marked simply Deck Access, escape, air, freedom from the suffocating weight of his realizations. He pushed it open, finding light brighter and more intense than the library's muted illumination. Salt spray stung his face, and the sound of the ocean, so different from the hushed sanctuary he'd just fled, filled his ears. The promenade deck. He'd stumbled onto the promenade deck, a part of the ship he had not yet visited. The vast expanse of ocean stretched before him, grey-blue and endless. The horizon was a clean, perfect line where sea met sky, offering no guidance, no comfort, only the infinite possibility of what lay beyond the visible. Crispin stepped forward, letting the door shut behind him with a firm thunk. The deck was largely deserted. A couple strolled arm in arm some distance away, and an elderly man dozed in a deck chair. No one to witness his undoing, no one to see him standing here, clutching the railing as if it were the only solid thing left in his world. He felt the vibration of the ship's engines through the cold metal. They were moving forward, inexorably, toward Tasmania, toward the debate with Maeve Penhaligon, toward the public spectacle he was now entirely unprepared for. What would he say tonight? How could he stand before an audience and defend a position he no longer believed in? How could he articulate a coherent thesis when his entire intellectual framework had just fractured, the load-bearing arguments giving way all at once? The wind ruffled his hair, carrying away the last vestiges of his academic composure. The ship continued its steady, charted course, while his own internal compass spun, seeking a new north. And then, as he stared out at the indifferent ocean, a thought formed, sharp and dangerous as a shard of glass. Tonight, on that stage, I could just tell them the truth. Not the rehearsed arguments, not the careful, footnoted position, but the raw, unfiltered truth of what he'd just discovered. The fundamental error in his life's work. His doubt, his breaking point, his cowardice, professionally suicidal, personally devastating. And yet, for the first time in his carefully ordered life, Crispin felt a wild, unfamiliar surge in his heart, something that might have been terror, but felt dizzyingly like exhilaration.